truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, February 10th, 2023, the 751st day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast on the day of its release. The only way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month, and in doing so, you will be supporting me, the work I do, and this show as it expands. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free a couple of days later on a wide variety of podcast platforms and, of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'm your moderator. Many times over the past nearly 3 years now that I've been doing this show, I have discussed what it is we consider intelligent and whether or not that definition actually matters in the world, whether or not that's reflective of something real and something important. And I was discussing all of this last night at length on Twitter, and so I want to share a few of the ideas I was working through. I wrote a few different threads and some random posts, but I've organized them and now I'm going to share them on the podcast. I wrote, "It's weird that we have come to define intelligence as the ability to fully memorize and recite many parts of the central narrative, be perceived as successful in terms of the central narrative, and profess to having a high IQ. Intelligence should be seen as the ability to reliably discern what's real and what's relevant, and then be consistently on the right side of every relevant decision point. If you can memorize the entire central narrative along each vertical, but you're still pretending masks worked, no, sorry, you're one of the dumbest people in all of human history. Your high IQ and all of your studies were absolutely worthless because you couldn't pass the baseline of intelligence thinking for yourself. We have imagined in our society that intelligence is kind of this abstract notion. You know, it goes along with the idea that we are all just brains in vats. We are this consciousness that exists in the head of this fleshy cage we find ourselves in, and that our consciousness, our abstract intelligence, has this certain inherent quality to it, as if having the most of this abstract intelligence is what makes you smarter than everyone else. And I don't think I have to explain this too deeply. It runs alongside our sense of education and our sense of credentialism. If someone went to MIT, they are absolutely smarter than virtually all of their peers. We have been led to imagine that simply because someone has a Harvard diploma or a Stanford diploma or a Yale or Princeton diploma, and you can go on and on and on, they must be among the smartest people in our culture. And we treat them that way regardless of what their supposed intelligence is actually producing in our culture. We imagine that these people are some part of a high priesthood of knowledge, where their presence in the hallowed halls of NYU or Columbia or Georgetown means they've acquired all of this secret knowledge and also the wisdom and judgment to employ that knowledge in intelligent ways. And I think by and large, we're coming to find out that's not true. We have been led down this path almost exclusively by people who ascribe to this notion of intelligence and people who have attended these schools and traded off their credentials and off the reputation of the university they attended. We are continually told that the people making these decisions are making so many counterintuitive decisions that don't turn out to help because they are actually the smartest people in the world. And despite any results they're able to actually produce in the real world, we still have to defer to them at all times because they're the ones with this prestigious education and with these great credentials. When they get things wrong, we are told that it's because the situations are just so complicated that no one could possibly get them right, and we still have the best people on it. These are the only people we can rely on to make decisions for us, and so we're just going to have to keep giving them a little more time and a little more leeway, a little more money, a little more power, and they're going to solve these problems. They haven't yet, but they're still the smartest people in the world, and they're the only people qualified to be making decisions for everyone else because they've attended these amazing universities and have these amazing credentials. And now we're to the point where there's no opportunity to ever actually say that these people are wrong. And again, that's a factor of our culture, our society, the way we are communicated to, the way we are informed about our world. We have to continue to give them all the power and leeway they need to continue executing their plans. If we have a disagreement with what the smartest people are saying, because we are not as smart as the smartest people, we are necessarily wrong and no longer welcome in the conversation. Because the conversation among the smartest people is only about the nuance of how they continue to press the same plan forward, regardless of the results. Now, naturally, when we are giving away our decision-making power and our money and allowing these people opportunity after opportunity to make decisions for us, we don't actually want to admit to ourselves to believe that we are doing so because society tells us that these people are smarter, these people are better educated, more well-credentialed, and the only people with the ability to make decisions for everyone else. We don't have that ability. We are so stupid, we can't even make decisions for ourselves, so we should never, ever be allowed to make decisions for anyone else. That's why we have to defer to this class of superior people who will make decisions for all of us. And I got thinking about all of this because, as we talked about the other day, Twitter's Yoel Roth wrote his doctoral thesis on the gay hookup app Grindr. And the title of his thesis was Gay Data. And me being me and enjoying the manipulation of words, I started thinking about how the phrase gay data could be taken in a few different ways. The most obvious is the one in which I imagine Yoel Roth intended it. This is data about being gay on Grindr. But of course, that phrase can also be parsed to mean that the data itself is gay. We're talking about gay data. Now, I'm a person who thinks that the phrase space is fake and gay is hilarious. I thought it was hilarious when that internet meme was going on years ago that said birds are fake. That's funny to me. Space being fake and gay is hilarious to me. And, there's an extent to which I actually do agree with that. We have certainly seen enough fake stuff about space from NASA and from our educational system, from our entertainment industry, all sorts of totally made up stuff about space. They take some quasi-scientific understanding of what we know about space. They read some articles, always by people from MIT, of course. And then we imagine space to be all of these things we simply don't know. And we don't know these things, okay? There's not actual evidence that the Big Bang is real. For instance, it is theoretical because it's impossible to have actually traveled back to that point and observe the Big Bang in process. It turns out that what we accept as scientific knowledge in a number of realms is the same way. People don't have firsthand experience of it. A theoretical construct is created, the hypothesis. It's tested. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But we've also reached the point where we accept that a whole range of ideas are quote unquote scientifically true, despite the fact that the hypothesis has never been proven. We are told that this or that is just the best understanding of what's happening at the time. And because it's science, we assume that means this is what's really going on. And if they're wrong, it's probably only in a small way that they will surely correct later. Well, we've spent years now seeing that's not how science works. And when you come to understand that, when you come to understand how easy it is to fall into the belief that all sorts of things are proven as true because science says so, and we incorporate those things as knowledge that everybody knows, it's unshakable because it's scientific. It might not be 100% right, but the mistakes would only be small, and surely they'll correct for them in the future. And scientists, like everyone else, are not immune to this. In fact, they might be the least immune people to this because they are the people with the most faith in the integrity of the science as an institution. And they will defend a range of scientific beliefs that they cannot prove and that they understand no one else can prove either. It's just the best understanding of the situation as we see it now. But you can't call them out on it because they went to MIT and you didn't. So because they trade in scientific knowledge that everybody knows and they have the credentials to back up the claim that they are an expert, now their expert credentials make that scientific thing that everybody knows even more true, even more indisputable and irrefutable. You can't prove what they're saying is false. Therefore, we have to side with their interpretation, even though they can't prove the thing they're saying is true. Now, in a normal world, the proper response is to revert to the null hypothesis, which is the hypothesis has not been proven. Therefore, we don't pretend it has, and we would remain agnostic regarding a certain subject. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. It is actually smarter to admit we don't know something than to pretend that we are absolutely certain about something we don't know. And this is not some new principle. This is literally the Socratic method. Socrates was known as the wisest man because Socrates knew that he knew nothing. He couldn't say that anything was definitively true beyond doubt because that's the nature of the world we live in. And when you understand that, you can begin to shed the emotional connections you have to this whole range of ideas you believe build up your entire world, your understanding of the world. It is more comfortable to believe that we have the answers because having the answers allows us to believe that we are doing the right thing and that we are in control. But again, that's not how the world works. We don't have definitive answers, and we have to be okay with that. Science done properly is humble enough to recognize that. And many of my conversations with scientists, doctors, etc. over the last few years are productive conversations specifically because there is still a scientific mind that understands that and knows that that is the productive approach when trying to understand complicated problems and complicated issues. But that's not what we get, and that's not how arguments are made to us. what we've seen for the last 3 years is a constant, never-ending argument about data. People online just sending the data back and forth as if all their numbers are magical. They just plucked them out of the world. They are objectively true because they're numbers, which for some reason implies that they have the imprimatur of objective mathematical equations. But they don't. They're just numbers. It actually does matter where they came from, how they were procured, and why a certain set of numbers is being preferred over another set of numbers. There is nothing about the numbers that can answer any of those questions. And as I was discussing yesterday regarding Joe Scarborough, he was using a fallacious argument from authority when citing our obviously stolen elections and a series of polls that in no way are required to represent reality. And between the election results and the polling numbers, Joe Scarborough believes he has proved his case that the American people side with the Scarborough Morning Mika, Morning Joe point of view. Their viewpoint on policy is actually reflected by the populace. Everyone agrees with Joe and Mika according to election results and polls, according to Joe Scarborough. But if we assume that the election results are all correct and legitimate and that the polls are entirely accurate, well, then Joe Scarborough's argument actually does make sense. The problem is the election results aren't legitimate and the polling results aren't accurate. There's no reason to believe they are. And so what he's done is properly form an argument, but made his argument on false premises based on authority, thereby refuting his argument. And that's exactly what we see with the data and how data is used. People treat data as if it's an argument in itself, and data is not an argument in itself. So back to Twitter, I wrote, here's the thing. If you understand there's a problem and you need to spend months gathering data to decide what to do about the problem, while failing to realize that the only problem that exists is the one you created, and while people are dying from the problem you created, you're only collecting data to justify the wrong or evil decisions you're making. And that is exactly what we saw happen. The data wouldn't be necessary if the response had worked. Proper decisions solve problems. If the problems aren't solved and you say the data supports the decisions you've been making, either you're lying or the data is worthless. Any conversation about COVID or anything else, honestly, where someone is arguing that the data says is an argument where someone is wrong and almost definitely lying. The data is just the data. It doesn't say anything, and that's just why it's gay. That it's usually fake makes it even worse. And if you're thinking, is he arguing that data is fake and gay? Yes, I am. Information as opposed to data is not gay. It is only information among other information. It does not recommend conclusions and does not argue that it's right in spite of real-world evidence to the contrary. It is only one of many reference points, and its reliability is always in question. In fact, that's why you don't rely on one single reference point for decision-making. Instead, we have people repeating the slogans and then using whatever made-up numbers they can grab to assert that the best thing to do is exactly what they were told. And we saw this over and over and over again throughout the very deadly pandemic. But let's just focus on lockdowns, right? So when lockdowns started, we were told that lockdowns were necessary. We needed 2 weeks to slow the spread. We needed 2 weeks to flatten the curve, because if the curve wasn't flattened, then hospitals were going to be overrun with sick patients. They wouldn't be able to care for all of them, and people would die unnecessarily. So what we need to do is shut our entire society down, our entire economy down, except for essential workers, of course, and then certain people at certain businesses, even though other people with similar businesses can't be open. But we're going to call that a lockdown, and we're going to say that this is actually recommended by the science, even though it had never been tried anywhere and there was no science to support it. But they sold us the entire idea because they showed us a graph and said, look, if we don't lock down, it's going to be this big curve that goes up very high before coming back down. And if we do lock down, it's going to be this smaller curve that doesn't go as high and lasts longer, because that's just how diseases work. Well, is that how diseases work, or is that theoretical? How would you know if that's how diseases work? Oh, it's because of the data about prior diseases. So that data is all good. That data is perfect. You have proven that lockdowns will work theoretically based on data you have before. And because you believe that's proven, then lockdowns are only prudent. In fact, if you disagree with locking down society, then it can only be because you actively want to kill people's grandma. The data says we must lock down. But of course, the data doesn't say that and can't say that because the thing was never tried before. But even if the data was perfect, it wouldn't have mattered because the data can't make decisions. The data cannot recommend decisions. The data is only information among other information. And at best, giving this information the benefit of the doubt, that data would have only been valuable as information among other information to the extent that it helped inform a wise decision among a number of other factors. Like, for instance, how deadly the disease actually is. Turns out, not very deadly. How easily the disease spreads. Turns out, doesn't spread the way we were told it did. But even if they were right about all those things, those still just would have been certain reference points of information among other reference points of information. We knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that unemployment, for instance, has massive downsides. Drug abuse, alcohol abuse, child abuse, loneliness, anxiety, depression, and increased suicide rates. And then there are all the practical concerns like we don't have money to pay for anything anymore, and we are losing our home. Normal people would have done a risk-benefit analysis on the whole thing and realized that lockdowns would definitely exact an enormous cost and that the benefits from lockdowns would only be theoretical unless you understand the actual motive of lockdowns, which was to prepare society for the Great Reset agenda. But we were told that all of the decisions were based on the data and the science, on all the latest research, and the smartest people in the world with the best educations and the best credentials, the only people capable of making decisions for everyone else, were the ones making them. So they're the only people that know the data and know the science. They're the only people capable of making these kinds of decisions. Therefore, they get all the power, and we are going to do what they say. You have to go along with it. That's the data. That's the science. But here's the thing. If the data was perfect in every way, and it takes 6 months to collect that data, it can support the argument that a resolved problem was responded to correctly. But it can't actually even prove that. All it can do is support the argument. Beyond that scenario, the data is actually worthless. It can't even provide relevant insight because the data is not conclusive. And people might say, well, we've recorded the data and the data show that the problem is going away a little bit. It's getting a little less bad. That means things are better now, which is, of course, a subjective judgment. And then from that subjective judgment, we had to take the leap that the data shows that our mitigation steps were actually successful when the data cannot prove that. If, for instance, the virus was real and had tapered off and gone away in 6 weeks after lockdowns and masks, the data could support the success of lockdowns and masks. But the data could not prove that lockdowns and masks worked, only that there was a correlation. Again, that makes the data totally irrelevant in terms of proving that masks and lockdowns worked, because the data is not capable of doing that. It's only capable of tracking the correlation. The disease that we're trying to mitigate could go away for a number of reasons. If, for instance, everyone had realized in May of 2020 that the virus was manipulated or manufactured in a lab and was brought to the world through a lab leak or perhaps intentionally, people might have put together the fact that this massive problem that we now have in the world was created by this group of people. Why are we being told to trust this group of people who created the problem in the first place? And why do we have to listen to them no matter what? Oh, it's because of their education and their credentials and the fact that they're backing up what they say with the data. Look at my magical numbers. Now obey me. And here's an example. People will say, the data proves vaccines are safe and effective. No, it doesn't. That's impossible. How do you define safety and effectiveness? The data say next to nothing about either. Safety and effectiveness are relative terms. And how do they describe safety and effectiveness to us? Well, they say it's safe because the vaccine has been given to, they claim, billions of people worldwide, and the side effects, the problems, are just very minimal. It's basically only anecdotal. The data says that the problems only happen like 0.0001% of the time. And of course, I pulled that number out of my ass just like they do. That isn't an argument for safety. Safety is a subjective term. The argument they're making is that it was worth it to kill and maim and sterilize and otherwise harm whatever percentage of people it is because the payoff was so great. That's why they talk about this stuff in the aggregate. Yes, it's sad that families lost their loved ones and people are debilitated with no hope of ever returning to their prior normal, healthy lives, and all the miscarriages, all the cancer. All of that is just the price we pay for saving the world from this terrible disease. And they use the data to make the effectiveness argument too. Effectiveness, again, is a subjective standard, and the data can't prove that the vaccines are effective. The data cannot prove the vaccines are effective. That's not possible. And the argument they make for the effectiveness is that fewer people are dying from COVID. Well, people are dying at much higher rates from everything else, so that might clue you in a bit. But the other thing is, viruses, as we are told from the experts, from the well-educated, from the people who have the best credentials in the field of virology that they cannot prove, say that viruses, when they mutate over time, actually become more transmissible and less virulent, which means they're less likely to harm people and less likely to kill people. If that happens at the same time people are being given a vaccine, then what's happening is that fewer people are dying from a virus that is less capable of causing death. That is not proof that the vaccines worked. What they are actually describing as the proof that vaccines are effective is only, and at best, a correlation with other things that are happening over that same period. So data cannot prove that the vaccines are safe and effective are both subjective terms. The argument is nonsense. But it actually gets worse than that because we have to remember the risk-benefit analysis. Why does it matter whether the data says that vaccines are safe and effective when they weren't necessary at all, except in a psychological sense? They provided the security blanket for people to go outside again. The vaccines were not necessary in any way when it comes to ending the pandemic or stopping COVID. There was no justification, aside from the psychological, for vaccines to even be considered with a disease that kills with an infection fatality rate on par with the flu. And everyone knows that because most people don't take the flu shot. And even fewer now will ever again because they know that vaccines don't work. But instead of dealing with the basic risk-benefit analysis, we were convinced to talk about data. Data literally cannot prove the vaccines are safe and effective, especially when they're not necessary. So why in the world have we spent 3 years watching people compare data on Twitter? Now, to be clear, I'm not arguing that data is never good or valuable. I'm arguing that at best, it is only information among other information. It is a luxury in an advanced society that can help inform our decision making, but it is by no means conclusive, which means that it's by no means necessary. For most of human history, we haven't had access to complex data, but humans have still survived just fine. And this matters because we have to stop making arguments based on data. The data doesn't say anything. Arguing about who has the best numbers misses the point entirely. If you have a problem and you're trying to come up with solutions, it's wise to gather all the information you can gather, determine how valuable and relevant each piece of information is, and then have a discussion centered around the morality and the effectiveness of the proposed solutions. Arguing about anything other than morality or effectiveness means one of the people in the argument is an idiot or a liar, and that person should be dismissed immediately. Smart people arguing with data because they think it's an effective weapon should stop. It's not an effective weapon. And that's why we're still losing. Because the people on our side, the people who agree with us, they think they need to prove their arguments through data. And then the people on the other side who believe that all arguments must be proven through data are going to side with them for some reason. If they can just get all of the magical numbers and pluck them out of the world and then show them to the other side, well, the other side's going to say, oh, well, you've bested me this time. Look at your magical numbers. How did you collect so many from the world? As if you're just playing Super Mario Brothers on the Nintendo 64. You're just jumping around the world, grabbing all the gold coins you can find. Ooh, more data. Ooh, more data. Bling, bling, bling. Data, data, data. Look at all the data I've collected. Now I'm showing you my data. Don't you see how good my data is? Don't you want to change your mind about this situation that has nothing to do with data and only has to do with morality and effectiveness? Aren't you going to change course now that you've seen my magical numbers? I have more magical numbers than you have. Now you have to listen to me. And this is how our arguments have proceeded. There are very intelligent people making arguments in exactly this way and failing to understand why people aren't just agreeing with them. And that's what we have. We've talked about this before on the podcast, but everybody wants to play a game of links and trade links, a game of sources and analyze. Ooh, I don't know about that source. I've heard bad things about that source. I can't trust the data that comes from that source. You're going to have to give me 4 more links before I accept that one of them becomes a source. Ooh, do you want to play a game of data? Let's play a game of data and we can trade data. Look at my numbers. Look at your numbers. Ooh, these are very serious numbers. This is what the very serious intellectuals on Twitter spend virtually all their time doing. I talked about this when that writer from The Atlantic, Connor Friedersdorf, was trying to argue to me that the data meant the vaccines were very safe and very effective. He wanted to play a game of links. He would have played a game of links all day long. Hey, do you want to play links? Do you want to play sources? Do you want to play data? No, Atlantic writer. You're supposed to be an intellectual. Can't we just have an intellectual conversation instead of copying and pasting links? Because you're trying to prove something true with data that can't be proven true with data. And it turns out that these are the only sorts of people who are still making the very serious intellectual, very intelligent arguments about how the regime is still doing all the right things all the time. Arguing intelligently while being wrong all the time doesn't make you almost as smart as the people who were right. And Scott Adams should learn this lesson at some point. Jordan Peterson would be wise to as well. They don't just get to hop off the track they were on and jump over to a parallel track and keep going. It's not like the vaccines were the only thing these morons have been wrong about in the last few years. They've been wrong about every single important issue, and wrong in exact opposite ways. They've been wrong because they've spent their time justifying their irrational positions to make them seem rational, because other people with very serious educations and very serious credentials only respect arguments when they're made on their terms, which means they don't actually respect the argument at all. It's just that you have to play within their set of rules to be included in the argument in the first place. So being the smartest person on the always wrong side doesn't make you almost as smart as the people who were right. It makes you dumber than everyone. I said last night, it makes you dumber than everyone but the people listening to you. And then I thought about it and I was like, well, that's not exactly right, because the people listening to a Ben Shapiro or a Scott Adams or a Jordan Peterson for their advice on things they have no particular expertise in whatsoever. To be clear, I'm not saying they don't have a right to their opinion or to share their opinion. Their opinion just shouldn't be preferenced because they're seen as experts or successful in some other domain that always comports with the central narrative. But the people who are listening to them are doing it because the culture has told them to. The culture has said these are the people to listen to, and that is constantly being reinforced by our culture all the time. But the people listening to these very serious intellectuals who are also always wrong at every important moment are more just brainwashed and respecting these figures as authority figures and going along with whatever they say. And maybe you'll agree, maybe you won't. But I actually think that's not quite as dumb as spending all your time making all of these intelligent rationalizations for holding positions that prove to be wrong in reality over and over and over and over again. Now, everybody's going to be wrong sometimes. I'm wrong quite often. I have thoughts about how things will be. They don't turn out to be that way. I've misread a situation. I've made a bad judgment. But on the important issues of our time within these last 3 years, we have been on the right side of all of them. These people have been on the wrong side of all of them. So either their intellectual approach to understanding the world is completely intellectually bankrupt, or these people are just evil. How long have we been told by politicians and very serious intellectuals, people of the regime, that we have these problems, they're implementing these solutions, the data says these solutions are working, but the problems still exist for decade after decade after decade? Should we assume that those people are properly using data to inform proper judgments? Of course not. They're still using data to ensure us that the problems even exist, like climate change, for instance, or COVID. But let's circle back around to our friend Yoel Roth. If it is possible to write a book called Gay Data, as Yoel Roth did, and be taken seriously by people who take data seriously, which has happened with Yoel Roth, and the conclusion of Yoel Roth's thesis is to argue that the data supports the morality and inevitability of the facilitation of pedophilia on Grindr, which Yoel Roth's thesis did do and did argue, I think my thesis is soundly proven. Data, as an argument, is both fake and gay. So let's stop pretending otherwise. Data is not an argument. Data is only, and at best, information among other information, and that's when data is perfect. This has been a public service announcement, and you're welcome. Now stop letting people win arguments by sending you links and sources and data. None of those are arguments. All of the links, all of the sources, all of the data can and should be questioned all the time. And because all of it is in doubt all the time, that means you should be arguing on a different level entirely. You should be talking about morality and effectiveness. If something doesn't work, you don't keep trying it just because someone else says the data supports it. And if something is immoral, like destroying people's lives for certain, you do not need data to know that that is always wrong. Now, changing subjects entirely without a segue, let's talk about Ukraine. Let's talk about the new article from Seymour Hersh. But before we do that, let's listen to Donald Trump's statement from yesterday about energy, because there is no way to understand what's happening in Ukraine without taking the energy factor into account.
Joe Biden's war on American energy is one of the key drivers of the worst inflation in 58 years, and it's hitting every single American family very, very hard. Biden reversed every action I took that achieved energy independence, and soon we were going to be energy dominant all over the world, energy dominant. He canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. He re-entered the horrendous Paris Climate Accord, so unfair to the United States, good for other countries, so bad for us. He put up huge roadblocks to new oil, gas, and coal production, and much, much more. In effect, Biden's anti-American energy crusade is a massive tax hike on everything. Higher energy costs raise the price of food, raw materials, shipping, transportation, construction, manufacturing, and everything else. The country that now benefits most from Joe Biden's radical left Green New Deal is China. High energy prices in America are a gift to China, a major factor in driving our heavy industry overseas. If you want to be an advanced manufacturing nation, you must be able to produce low-cost energy. You'll never be a rich nation without it. And if you want to deindustrialize the United States, then you would seek to drive up the cost of energy here as much as possible, just as Joe Biden has done, perhaps unknowingly. That I don't know. That's why Biden's energy agenda is China's energy agenda. That's why China signs up for every stupid globalist climate deal and then immediately breaks it. They don't live up to their deals. When I'm back in the White House, I will bring back a pro-American energy policy at long last. As you know, China paid hundreds of billions of dollars to the United States when I was president. No other president got 10 cents. Check it out. Not even 10 cents. I will deploy a team of warrior lawyers to hunt down every unnecessary regulation in the Federal Registry that hampers domestic production, and we will wipe them off the books. We will again get out of Paris, and we will rapidly issue approvals for all worthy energy infrastructure projects with a focus on maximum speed to bring prices down rapidly. So get those proposals ready now, because we are going to put thousands of Americans to work building the power plants, pipelines, grids, ports, refineries, and shipping terminals of tomorrow. We are going to have very inexpensive energy again, like we did just 2.5 years ago. This great undertaking will also help restore hope and aspiration to America's young people. Instead of being irrationally terrified by political predictions of climate apocalypse, instead of toiling for low wages or left-wing make-work projects, I have a vision that will give young Americans the chance to find real meaning in work once again, like we had it 2.5 years ago. Building the backbone of America that is powerful, prosperous, productive, vigorous, modern, independent, and free. We will be great again as a country under the next Trump administration. The return of American jobs and the American dream will be powered by the return of American energy. Nobody has more liquid gold under their feet than the United States of America, and we will use it and profit by it and live with it, and we will be rich again, and we will be happy again, and we will be proud again. Thank you very much.
Energy and access to energy are a foundational element of any successful advanced society. It is undeniable. And despite that, what we have is a world where the control over energy supplies means control over societies. And rather than creating an abundance of American energy for the good of our society, we have the regime intentionally creating deficiencies, and that weakens our position in the world relative to other countries. And of course, this applies to other countries too. America should be America first. Other countries should put the good of their country and their people first. A country's energy supply being threatened is one of the greatest threats a country can face. And so let's get into this Sy Hersh piece. Now, Seymour Sy Hersh is a legendary journalist to the extent that we have legendary journalists. He has always been a leftist, but my understanding, my impression of Seymour Hersh is that beyond being a leftist, he is anti-regime. It so happens that leftism and the regime are the same things, but throughout points in our society, they have not seemed that way because the regime can exhibit the characteristics of, quote unquote, both sides when it comes to the American Democrat versus Republican paradigm. While Joe McCarthy was trying to figure out who all the communists in the United States were, it was easy to paint Joe McCarthy as part of the regime to the extent they held power. Regime communists in America were not seen to be holding power, so they seemed like they were not of the regime. And very committed leftists believed that they were not of the regime. But when we look at the history from then until now, we see the same communist elements throughout the world, all in service to the same regime. And viewing this through the Democrat versus Republican paradigm rather than the global communism versus sovereign nationalism paradigm leads to a lot of confusion. There are people who will call Sy Hersh anti-American, and I would suggest that that's largely because of this same confusion. Just the same, there are people who call us anti-American for not supporting the regime's war efforts in Ukraine. But that is clearly not the case. I think maybe it's better to leave that stuff aside and focus on the work Seymour Hersh has done, which is important and relevant and has garnered a lot of respect over the years. He's well-sourced and he's someone to be taken seriously. He reported on the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. He reported on the abuses at Abu Ghraib. And he's reported about how the Obama-directed mission to kill Osama bin Laden did not go down how the TV told us it did. And now we have this piece, which has been in the pipeline for months. I was told he had a big piece coming out a month ago, and it was supposed to come out every week since then, and now it's out. But he's had this in the pipeline for a while, and he's reporting on the explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline from last September. The headline is How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline. The U.S. Navy's Diving and Salvage Center can be found in a location as obscure as its name, down what was once a country lane in rural Panama City, a now booming resort city in the southwestern panhandle of Florida, 70 miles south of the Alabama border. The center's complex is as nondescript as its location, a drab concrete post-World War II structure that has the look of a vocational high school on the west side of Chicago. A coin-operated laundromat and a dance school are across what is now a 4-lane road. The center has been training highly skilled deep-water divers for decades who, once assigned to American military units worldwide, are capable of technical diving to do the good using C4 explosives to clear harbors and beaches of debris and unexploded ordnance, as well as the bad, like blowing up foreign oil rigs, fouling intake valves for undersea power plants, destroying locks on crucial shipping canals. The Panama City Center, which boasts the second largest indoor pool in America, was the perfect place to recruit the best and most taciturn graduates of the diving school who successfully did last summer what they had been authorized to do 260 feet under the surface of the Baltic Sea. Last June, the Navy divers, operating under the cover of a widely publicized midsummer NATO exercise known as Balltops 22, planted the remotely triggered explosives that 3 months later destroyed 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines, according to a source with direct knowledge of the operational planning. Okay? So this is what you have to accept the truth of this piece. You have to accept that Cy Hersh has a source, that source has direct knowledge, and that source is telling the truth. Now, those are things that we cannot know 100%, but Cy Hersh's sources have traditionally been correct. 2 of the pipelines, which were known collectively as Nord Stream 1, had been providing Germany and much of Western Europe with cheap Russian natural gas for more than a decade. A second pair of pipelines called Nord Stream 2 had been built, but were not yet operational. Now, with Russian troops massing on the Ukrainian border and the bloodiest war in Europe since 1945 looming, President Joseph Biden saw the pipelines as a vehicle for Vladimir Putin to weaponize natural gas for his political and territorial ambitions. Asked for comment, Adrienne Watson, a White House spokesperson, said in an email, "This is false and complete fiction." Tammy Thorpe, a spokesperson for the Central Intelligence Agency, similarly wrote, "This claim is completely and utterly false." Biden's decision to sabotage the pipelines came after more than 9 months of highly secret back and forth debate inside Washington's national security community about how best to achieve that goal. For much of that time, the issue was not whether to do the mission, but how to get it done with no overt clue as to who was responsible. There was a vital bureaucratic reason for relying on the graduates of the center's hardcore diving school in Panama City. The divers were Navy only and not members of America's Special Forces Command, whose covert operations must be reported to Congress and briefed in advance to the Senate and House leadership, the so-called Gang of Eight. The Biden administration was doing everything possible to avoid leaks as the planning took place in late 2021 and into the first months of 2022. President Biden and his foreign policy team, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, and Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State for Policy, had been vocal and consistent in their hostility to the 2 pipelines, which ran side by side for 750 miles under the Baltic Sea, from 2 different ports in northeastern Russia near the Estonian border, passing close to the Danish island of Bornholm before ending in northern Germany. And it's worth always remembering Victoria Nuland was part of the Obama administration. She's part of the Biden administration. Victoria Nuland was on that leaked phone call discussing who the replacement president for Ukraine would be after they toppled Ukraine's government in 2014. She is also the woman who in Senate testimony admitted to Marco Rubio that the United States was funding Defense Department bioweapons labs in Ukraine. But wait, did I say bioweapons labs? No, they're just biolabs where they do research to prevent the problems that they could also potentially cause through the exact same research. And yes, they are storing and manipulating highly dangerous pathogens, but it's just to keep everybody safe. The direct route, which bypassed any need to transit Ukraine, had been a boon for the German economy, which enjoyed an abundance of cheap Russian natural gas, enough to run its factories and heat its homes, while enabling German distributors to sell excess gas at a profit throughout Western Europe. Action that could be traced to the administration would violate U.S. promises to minimize direct conflict with Russia. Secrecy was essential. From its earliest days, Nord Stream 1 was seen by Washington and its anti-Russian NATO partners as a threat to Western dominance. The holding company behind it, Nord Stream AG, was incorporated in Switzerland in 2005 in partnership with Gazprom, a publicly traded Russian company producing enormous profits for shareholders, which is dominated by oligarchs known to be in the thrall of Putin. Gazprom controlled 51% of the company, with 4 European energy firms, one in France, one in the Netherlands, and 2 in Germany, sharing the remaining 49% of stock and having the right to control downstream sales of the inexpensive natural gas to local distributors in Germany and Western Europe. Gazprom's profits were shared with the Russian government, and state gas and oil revenues were estimated in some years to amount to as much as 45% of Russia's annual budget. How about that? The Russian government is funded by selling energy? That's the sort of thing you can do when you're energy dominant and producing energy. So why are we taxed so much, and why is Joe Biden cutting off our energy supplies? Isn't that strange? America's political fears were real. Putin would now have an additional and much-needed major source of income, and Germany and the rest of Western Europe would become addicted to low-cost natural gas supplied by Russia, while diminishing European reliance on America. In fact, that's exactly what happened. Many Germans saw Nord Stream 1 as part of the deliverance of former Chancellor Willy Brandt's famed Ostpolitik theory, which would enable post-war Germany to rehabilitate itself and other European nations destroyed in World War II by, among other initiatives, utilizing cheap Russian gas to fuel a prosperous Western European market and trading economy. Nord Stream 1 was dangerous enough in the view of NATO and Washington, but Nord Stream 2, whose construction was completed in September of 2021, would, if approved by German regulators, double the amount of cheap gas that would be available to Germany and Western Europe. The second pipeline would also provide enough gas for more than 50% of Germany's annual consumption. Tensions were constantly escalating between Russia and NATO, backed by the aggressive foreign policy of the Biden administration. Opposition to Nord Stream 2 flared on the eve of the Biden inauguration in January 2021, when Senate Republicans, led by Ted Cruz of Texas, repeatedly raised the political threat of cheap Russian natural gas during the confirmation hearing of Antony Blinken as Secretary of State. By then, a unified Senate had successfully passed a law that, as Cruz told Blinken, quote, halted the pipeline in its tracks, end quote. There would be enormous political and economic pressure from the German government, then headed by Angela Merkel, to get the second pipeline online. Would Biden stand up to the Germans? Blinken said yes, but added that he had not discussed the specifics of the incoming president's views. I know his strong conviction that this is a bad idea, the Nord Stream 2, he said. I know that he would have us use every persuasive tool that we have to convince our friends and partners, including Germany, not to move forward with it. A few months later, as the construction of the second pipeline neared completion, Biden blinked. That May, in a stunning turnaround, the administration waived sanctions against Nord Stream AG, with a State Department official conceding that trying to stop the pipeline through sanctions and diplomacy had, quote, always been a long shot. Behind the scenes, administration officials reportedly urged Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, by then facing a threat of Russian invasion, not to criticize the move. There were immediate consequences. Senate Republicans, led by Cruz, announced an immediate blockade of all of Biden's foreign policy nominees and delayed passage of the annual defense bill for months deep into the fall. Politico later depicted Biden's turnabout on the second Russian pipeline as, quote, the one decision, arguably more than the chaotic military withdrawal from Afghanistan, that has imperiled Biden's agenda. The administration was floundering, despite getting a reprieve on the crisis in mid-November, when Germany's energy regulators suspended approval of the second Nord Stream pipeline. Natural gas prices surged 8% within days, amid growing fears in Germany and Europe that the pipeline suspension and the growing possibility of a war between Russia and Ukraine would lead to a very much unwanted cold winter. It was not clear to Washington just where Olaf Scholz, Germany's newly appointed chancellor, stood. Months earlier, after the fall of Afghanistan, Scholz had publicly endorsed French President Emmanuel Macron's call for a more autonomous European foreign policy in a speech in Prague, clearly suggesting less reliance on Washington and its mercurial actions. Throughout all of this, Russian troops had been steadily and ominously building up on the borders of Ukraine, and by the end of December, more than 100,000 soldiers were in position to strike from Belarus and Crimea. Alarm was growing in Washington, including an assessment from Blinken that those troop numbers could be, quote, doubled in short order. The administration's attention once again focused on the Nord Stream. As long as Europe remained dependent on the pipelines for cheap natural gas, Washington was afraid that countries like Germany would be reluctant to supply Ukraine with the money and weapons it needed to defeat Russia. It was at this unsettled moment that Biden authorized Jake Sullivan to bring together an interagency group to come up with a plan. All options were on the table, but only one would emerge. Now let's circle back to one very important sentence here. Washington was afraid that countries like Germany would be reluctant to supply Ukraine with the money and weapons it needed to defeat Russia if Europe was dependent on cheap natural gas. So if they remove the ability for Europe to have cheap natural gas from Russia, Germany would be more inclined to support the regime's war effort in Ukraine. That was the calculation. Germany's access to cheap resources was the bargaining chip. In December of 2021, 2 months before the first Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, Jake Sullivan convened a meeting of a newly formed task force, men and women from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, and the State and Treasury Departments, and asked for recommendations about how to respond to Putin's impending invasion. It would be the first of a series of top-secret meetings in a secure room on a top floor of the old executive office building, adjacent to the White House. That was also the home of the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. There was the usual back-and-forth chatter that eventually led to a crucial preliminary question. Would the recommendation forwarded by the group to the president be reversible, such as another layer of sanctions and currency restrictions, or irreversible? That is, kinetic actions which could not be undone. What became clear to participants, according to the source with direct knowledge of the process, is that Sullivan intended for the group to come up with a plan for the destruction of the 2 Nord Stream pipelines, and that he was delivering on the desires of the president. Over the next several meetings, the participants debated options for an attack. The Navy proposed a newly commissioned submarine to assault the pipeline directly. The Air Force discussed dropping bombs with delayed fuses that could be set off remotely. The CIA argued that whatever was done, it would have to be covert. Everyone involved understood the stakes. This is not kiddie stuff, the source said. If the attack were traceable to the United States, it's an act of war. And of course it is. That is an unprovoked attack on foreign energy infrastructure. Under what authority did the fake president commit this act of war? Congress didn't declare war. Joe Biden's not even a legitimate president, but a legitimate president also cannot just go bombing other countries' energy infrastructure. Putin's brutal aggression? That's not just an attack on energy infrastructure in service of energy control by the fake president who's destroying domestic energy. It's an attack on the people of Russia and Europe, who shouldn't have to spend their savings on not freezing to death on the European side or suffering through the economic impacts on either side. What does it say about Putin that he has not responded in kind to this obvious unprovoked act of war? They are proactively making a decision to engage in an act of war in order to leverage energy resources over Germany. At the time, the CIA was directed by William Burns, a mild-mannered former ambassador to Russia who had served as Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration. Burns quickly authorized an agency working group, and by agency he means the CIA here, whose ad hoc members included, by chance, someone who was familiar with the capabilities of the Navy's deep-sea divers in Panama City. Over the next few weeks, members of the CIA's working group began to craft a plan for a covert operation that would use deep-sea divers to trigger an explosion along the pipeline. Something like this had been done before. In 1971, the American intelligence community learned from still undisclosed sources that two important units of the Russian Navy were communicating via an undersea cable buried in the Sea of Okhotsk on Russia's far east coast. The cable linked a regional Navy command to the mainland headquarters at Vladivostok. A hand-picked team of Central Intelligence Agency and National Security Agency operatives was assembled somewhere in the Washington area under deep cover and worked out a plan using Navy divers, modified submarines, and a deep submarine rescue vehicle that succeeded after much trial and error in locating the Russian cable. The divers planted a sophisticated listening device on the cable that successfully intercepted the Russian traffic and recorded it on a taping system. The NSA learned that senior Russian Navy officers, convinced of the security of their communication link, chatted away with their peers without encryption. The recording device and its tape had to be replaced monthly, and the project rolled on merrily for a decade until it was compromised by a 44-year-old civilian NSA technician named Ronald Pelton, who was fluent in Russian. Pelton was betrayed by a Russian defector in 1985 and sentenced to prison. He was paid just $5,000 by the Russians for his revelations about the operation, along with $35,000 for other Russian operational data he provided that was never made public. That underwater success, codenamed Ivy Bells, was innovative and risky and produced invaluable intelligence about the Russian Navy's intentions and planning. Still, the interagency group was initially skeptical of the CIA's enthusiasm for a covert deep-sea attack. There were too many unanswered questions. The waters of the Baltic Sea were heavily patrolled by the Russian Navy, and there were no oil rigs that could be used as cover for a diving operation. Would the divers have to go to Estonia, right across the border from Russia's natural gas loading docks, to train for the mission? It would be a goat fuck, the agency was told. Throughout all of this scheming, the source said, some working guys in the CIA and the State Department were saying, don't do this. It's stupid and will be a political nightmare if it comes out. Nevertheless, in early 2022, the CIA working group reported back to Sullivan's interagency group. We have a way to blow up the pipelines. What came next was stunning. On February 7th, less than 3 weeks before the seemingly inevitable Russian invasion of Ukraine, Biden met in his White House office with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who, after some wobbling, was now firmly on the American team. At the press briefing that followed, Biden defiantly said, if Russia invades, there will no longer be a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it. 20 days earlier, Undersecretary Nuland had delivered essentially the same message at a State Department briefing with little press coverage. She said, I want to be very clear to you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward. And here's the audio of those two statements.
I want to be clear with you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
But how will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Several of those involved in planning the pipeline mission were dismayed by what they viewed as indirect references to the attack. It was like putting an atomic bomb on the ground in Tokyo and telling the Japanese that we are going to detonate it, the source said. The plan was for the options to be executed post-invasion and not advertised publicly. Biden simply didn't get it or ignored it. Biden's and Nuland's indiscretion, if that is what it was, might have frustrated some of the planners, but it also created an opportunity. According to the source, some of the senior officials of the CIA determined that blowing up the pipeline, quote, no longer could be considered a covert option because the president just announced that we knew how to do it, end quote. The plan to blow up Nord Stream 1 and 2 was suddenly downgraded from a covert operation requiring that Congress be informed to one that was deemed as a highly classified intelligence operation with U.S. military support. Under the law, the source explained, quote, there was no longer a legal requirement to report the operation to Congress. All they had to do now is just do it. But it still had to be secret. The Russians have superlative surveillance of the Baltic Sea. The agency working group members had no direct contact with the White House and were eager to find out if the president meant what he'd said. That is, if the mission was now a go. The source recalled, Bill Burns comes back and says, do it. The operation. Norway was the perfect place to base the mission. In the past few years of East-West crisis, the U.S. military has vastly expanded its presence inside Norway, whose western border runs 1,400 miles along the North Atlantic Ocean and merges above the Arctic Circle with Russia. The Pentagon has created high-paying jobs and contracts amid some local controversy by investing hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade and expand American Navy and Air Force facilities in Norway. The new works included, most importantly, an advanced synthetic aperture radar far up north that was capable of penetrating deep into Russia and came online just as the American intelligence community lost access to a series of long-range listening sites inside China. And what does that mean that they lost access inside China? That's very odd. We know that the illegitimate Biden administration is fully compromised by China. So it's possible that they were just further stripping Joe Biden of his power and the regime of its power. But then you would also have to assume that the Chinese Communist Party, who have been empowered by the regime for decades, are no longer aligned with regime interests. Now, the problem, as it always is how we perceive these foreign countries. We know in America there are factions. We have the good twin, evil twin dynamic, not the Democrat-Republican paradigm. What I mean by that is what I mentioned before. Global communism, that's the evil twin, versus sovereign nationalism. That's the good twin. This dynamic is represented in every country around the world, and it is represented in China. The regime is battling against sovereign nationalist leaders in every country in the world. That is the struggle for global centralized control versus each country being a sovereign nation, making decisions in the best interests of that country and its citizens. So in that paradigm, the regime losing access in China is potentially an indicator of something much larger. A newly refurbished American submarine base, which had been under construction for years, had become operational, and more American submarines were now able to work closely with their Norwegian colleagues to monitor and spy on a major Russian nuclear redoubt 250 miles to the east on the Kola Peninsula. America also has vastly expanded a Norwegian air base in the north and delivered to the Norwegian Air Force a fleet of Boeing-built P-8 Poseidon patrol planes to bolster its long-range spying on all things Russia. In return, the Norwegian government angered liberals and some moderates in its parliament last November by passing the Supplementary Defense Cooperation Agreement. Under the New Deal, the U.S. legal system would have jurisdiction in certain agreed areas in the North over American soldiers accused of crimes off base, as well as over those Norwegian citizens accused or suspected of interfering with the work at the base. Can you believe that? The U.S. legal system claimed jurisdiction over parts of Norway and its citizens, and the Norwegian government agreed to this arrangement, even though the Norwegian people didn't want it. And they passed it as part of a Supplementary Defense Cooperation Agreement. Isn't that amazing? Just giving away the sovereignty of the country to the regime based on an agreement in part of their government. Sounds like here. Norway was one of the original signatories of the NATO treaty in 1949, in the early days of the Cold War. Today, the supreme commander of NATO is Jens Stoltenberg, a committed anti-communist who served as Norway's prime minister for 8 years before moving to his high NATO post with American backing in 2014. And again, I would love to ask Seymour Hersh about his labeling of Stoltenberg as an anti-communist. He was a hardliner on all things Putin and Russia, who had cooperated with the American intelligence community since the Vietnam War. He has been trusted completely since. He is the glove that fits the American hand, the source said. Back in Washington, planners knew they had to go to Norway. They hated the Russians, and the Norwegian Navy was full of superb sailors and divers who had generations of experience in highly profitable deep-sea oil and gas exploration, the source said. They could also be trusted to keep the mission secret. The Norwegians may have had other interests as well. The destruction of Nord Stream, if the Americans could pull it off, would allow Norway to sell vastly more of its own natural gas to Europe. And so there you have it. Norway went along with this act of war to increase profits for Norwegian energy companies. Sometime in March, a few members of the team flew to Norway to meet with the Norwegian Secret Service and Navy. One of the key questions was where exactly in the Baltic Sea was the best place to plant the explosives. Nord Stream 1 and 2, each with 2 sets of pipelines, were separated much of the way by little more than a mile as they made their run to the port of Greifswald in the far northeast of Germany. The Norwegian Navy was quick to find the right spot in the shallow waters of the Baltic Sea a few miles off Denmark's Bornholm Island. The pipelines ran more than a mile apart along a seafloor that was only 260 feet deep. That would be well within the range of the divers who, operating from a Norwegian Alta-class mine hunter, would dive with a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium streaming from their tanks and plant shaped C4 charges on the 4 pipelines with concrete protective covers. It would be tedious, time-consuming, and dangerous work, but the waters off Bornholm had another advantage. There were no major tidal currents, which would have made the task of diving much more difficult. After a bit of research, the Americans were all in. At this point, the Navy's obscure deep diving group in Panama City once again came into play. The deep-sea schools at Panama City, whose trainees participated in Ivy Bells, are seen as an unwanted backwater by the elite graduates of the Naval Academy in Annapolis, who typically seek the glory of being assigned as a SEAL, fighter pilot, or submariner. If one must become a black shoe, that is, a member of the less desirable surface ship command, there is always at least duty on a destroyer, cruiser, or amphibious ship. The least glamorous of all is mine warfare. Its divers never appear in Hollywood movies or on the cover of popular magazines. The best divers with deep diving qualifications are a tight community, and only the very best are recruited for the operation and told to be prepared to be summoned to the CIA in Washington, the source said. The Norwegians and Americans had a location in the operatives, but there was another concern. Any unusual underwater activity in the waters off Bornholm might draw the attention of the Swedish or Danish navies, which could report it. Denmark had also been one of the original NATO signatories and was known in the intelligence community for its special ties to the United Kingdom. Sweden had applied for membership into NATO and had demonstrated its great skill in managing its underwater sound and magnetic sensor systems that successfully tracked Russian submarines that would occasionally show up in remote waters of the Swedish archipelago and be forced to the surface. The Norwegians joined the Americans in insisting that some senior officials in Denmark and Sweden had to be briefed in general terms about a possible diving activity in the area. In that way, someone higher up could intervene and keep a report out of the chain of command, thus insulating the pipeline operation. What they were told and what they knew were purposely different, the source told me. The Norwegian embassy, asked to comment on the story, did not respond. The Norwegians were key to solving other hurdles. The Russian Navy was known to possess surveillance technology capable of spotting and triggering underwater mines. The American explosive devices needed to be camouflaged in a way that would make them appear to the Russian system as part of the natural background, something that required adapting to the specific salinity of the water. the Norwegians had a fix. The Norwegians also had a solution to the crucial question of when the operation should take place. Every June for the past 21 years, the American Sixth Fleet, whose flagship is based in Gaeta, Italy, south of Rome, has sponsored a major NATO exercise in the Baltic Sea involving scores of Allied ships throughout the region. The current exercise, held in June, would be known as Baltic Operations 22 or Baltops 22. The Norwegians proposed this would be the ideal cover to plant the mines. The Americans provided one vital element. They convinced the Sixth Fleet planners to add a research and development exercise to the program. The exercise, as made public by the Navy, involved the Sixth Fleet in collaboration with the Navy's research and warfare centers. The at-sea event would be held off the coast of Bornholm Island and involve NATO teams of divers planting mines, with competing teams using the latest underwater technology to find and destroy them. It was both a useful exercise and ingenious cover. The Panama City boys would do their thing, and the C4 explosives would be in place by the end of Baltops 22 with a 48-hour timer attached. All of the Americans and Norwegians would be long gone by the first explosion. The days were counting down. The clock was ticking, and we were nearing mission accomplished, the source said. And then Washington had second thoughts. The bombs would still be planted during Baltops, but the White House worried that a 2-day window for their detonation would be too close to the end of the exercise, and it would be obvious that America had been involved. Instead, the White House had a new request. Can the guys in the field come up with some way to blow the pipelines later on command? Some members of the planning team were angered and frustrated by the president's seeming indecision. The Panama City divers had repeatedly practiced planting the C4 on pipelines, as they would during Baltops. But now the team in Norway had to come up with a way to give Biden what he wanted, the ability to issue a successful execution order at a time of his choosing. Being tasked with an arbitrary last-minute change was something the CIA was accustomed to managing, but it also renewed the concerns some shared over the necessity and legality of the entire operation. The president's secret orders also evoked the CIA's dilemma in the Vietnam War days, when President Johnson, confronted by growing anti-Vietnam War sentiment, ordered the agency to violate its charter, which specifically barred it from operating inside America, by spying on anti-war leaders to determine whether they were being controlled by communist Russia. So let's get this straight for just 1 second. The guy who became president after the CIA assassinated JFK eventually ordered the CIA to violate its charter, forcing them to operate in America. And then the CIA took out another president here and overthrew governments abroad. Isn't that incredible? So Lyndon B. Johnson, the man the CIA put in power, is the one responsible for ordering the CIA to violate its charter. Does that make any sense? Of course it doesn't. The agency ultimately acquiesced, and throughout the 1970s, it became clear just how far it had been willing to go. There were subsequent newspaper revelations in the aftermath of the Watergate scandals about the agency's spying on American citizens, its involvement in the assassination of foreign leaders, and its undermining of the socialist government of Salvador Allende. Those revelations led to a dramatic series of hearings in the mid-1970s in the Senate, led by Frank Church of Idaho, that made it clear that Richard Helms, the agency director at the time, accepted that he had an obligation to do what the president wanted, even if it meant violating the law. Got that? So the CIA has to obey the president, even though the CIA controls the president. That's very convenient for the CIA, isn't it? They can do whatever they want, and it's always the president's responsibility. And of course, because they control the president through corruption, compromise, or any number of other things, the president has to do what they want. So basically, the president is just a cover for the CIA to do whatever it wants around the world and in America. You get it? That's the picture we are operating with here. In unpublished closed-door testimony, Helms ruefully explained that, quote, you almost have an immaculate conception when you do something, end quote, under secret orders from a president. Whether it's right that you should have it or wrong that you should have it, the CIA works under different rules and ground rules than any other part of the government. He was essentially telling the senators that he, as head of the CIA, understood that he had been working for the crown and not the Constitution. And I wonder if Seymour Hersh is using that phrase, the crown, figuratively, meaning that they serve a higher purpose than the Constitution, and that's what he's calling the crown, or whether he means it more literally, in the sense that the CIA is legitimately working for the crown. The Americans at work in Norway operated under the same dynamic and dutifully began work on the new problem, how to remotely detonate the C4 explosives on Biden's order. It was a much more demanding assignment than those in Washington understood. There was no way for the team in Norway to know when the president might push the button. Would it be in a few weeks, in many months, or in half a year or longer? The C4 attached to the pipelines would be triggered by a sonar buoy dropped by a plane on short notice, but the procedure involved the most advanced signal processing technology. Once in place, the delayed timing devices attached to any of the 4 pipelines could be accidentally triggered by the complex mix of ocean background noises throughout the heavily trafficked Baltic Sea. From near and distant ships, underwater drilling, seismic events, waves, and even sea creatures. To avoid this, the sonar buoy, once in place, would emit a sequence of unique, low-frequency tonal sounds, much like those emitted by a flute or a piano, that would be recognized by the timing device and, after preset hours of delay, trigger the explosives. You want a signal that is robust enough so that no other signal could accidentally send a pulse that detonated the explosives, I was told by Dr. Theodore Postel, Professor Emeritus of Science, Technology, and National Security Policy at MIT. Postel, who has served as the science advisor to the Pentagon's Chief of Naval Operations, said the issue facing the group in Norway because of Biden's delay was one of chance. The longer the explosives are in the water, the greater risk there would be of a random signal that would launch the bombs. And that does sound like a pretty precarious situation. On September 26, 2022, a Norwegian Navy P-8 surveillance plane made a seemingly routine flight and dropped a sonar buoy. The signal spread underwater, initially to Nord Stream 2 and then on to Nord Stream 1. A few hours later, the high-powered C4 explosives were triggered and 3 of the 4 pipelines were put out of commission. Within a few minutes, pools of methane gas that remained in the shuttered pipelines could be seen spreading on the water's surface, and the world learned that something irreversible had taken place. And it is always worth recalling that when we began to hear about this explosion, one of the first reactions from the regime and its mouthpieces was to say that they believed Russia had hijacked its own pipelines and removed their own energy resource leverage over European nations who Russia did not want to have involved in the Ukraine situation. That never made any sense. And we have had hint after hint, piece of evidence after piece of evidence throughout these last 5 months that British intelligence was involved and American intelligence was involved. And now we have extensive reporting on that. Whether you choose to believe the reporting is up to you. The fallout. In the immediate aftermath of the pipeline bombing, the American media treated it like an unsolved mystery. Russia was repeatedly cited as a likely culprit, spurred on by calculated leaks from the White House, but without ever establishing a clear motive for such an act of self-sabotage beyond simple retribution. A few months later, when it emerged that Russian authorities had been quietly getting estimates for the cost to repair the pipelines, the New York Times described the news as, quote, complicating theories about who was behind the attack. No major American newspaper dug into the earlier threats to the pipelines made by Biden and Undersecretary of State Nuland. While it was never clear why Russia would seek to destroy its own lucrative pipeline, a more telling rationale for the president's actions came from Secretary of State Blinken. Asked at a press conference last September about the consequences of the worsening energy crisis in Europe, Blinken described the moment as a potentially good one. He says, "It's a tremendous opportunity to once and for all remove the dependence on Russian energy and thus take away from Vladimir Putin the weaponization of energy as a means of advancing his imperial designs. That's very significant, and that offers tremendous strategic opportunity for the years to come. But meanwhile, we are determined to do everything we possibly can to make sure the consequences of all of this are not borne by citizens in our countries or, for that matter, around the world." Now, each and every word of that is untrue, and it's amazing that he can describe Vladimir Putin's actions as the weaponization of energy as a means of advancing his imperial designs, when we can see quite conclusively, if this reporting is to be trusted, and if we are to take Biden, Blinken, and Nuland at their word, that it is the global regime and our own evil twin faction of that regime in the United States who are weaponizing access to energy resources. And let's remember what this is. They blew up a gas pipeline. The people who are pushing the climate change agenda, the Green New Deal, the people who are asking everyone to sacrifice their own lives, essentially, their standard of living, in order to save the planet from the sun, intentionally caused a massive environmental crisis. So apparently they're not all that opposed to creating an environmental crisis if it further empowers them. Kind of makes me think back and wonder about that whole BP oil spill that happened under Obama. And naturally, at the time, we were told that even this man-made environmental disaster was further proof that we needed to do more to save the planet from the sun. And isn't it amazing that none of our mainstream news outlets have dug into this story and tried to figure out what actually happened? Again, as always, they are only running interference for the regime because they don't want the regime's actions to be exposed. More recently, Victoria Nuland expressed satisfaction at the demise of the newest of the pipelines. Testifying at a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing in late January, she told Senator Ted Cruz, quote, "Like you, I am, and I think the administration is, very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea." Why would Ted Cruz be happy about Biden's unprovoked act of war? That is a question that deserves answering. The source had a much more streetwise view of Biden's decision to sabotage more than 1,500 miles of Gazprom pipeline as winter approached. "Well," he said, speaking of the president, "I gotta admit the guy has a pair of balls. He said he was going to do it, and he did it." Asked why he thought the Russians failed to respond, he said cynically, "Maybe they want the capability to do the same things the U.S. did. It was a beautiful cover story," he went on. "Behind it was a covert operation that placed experts in the field and equipment that operated on a covert signal. The only flaw was the decision to do it." So the fake president, unprovoked, staged this act of war against foreign energy infrastructure in order to leverage the support of Germany and other European nations for the regime's war effort in Ukraine. And this is not only an attack on the energy infrastructure, it's not only an attack on the affected countries, it is an attack on the citizens of those countries. The fake president doesn't have balls. He's the career boss of a crime family and a sexual degenerate who molests children in public and showered with his daughter. He's a sociopath who believes he's entitled to everything he wants. He's just too stupid to pull it off forever without people finding out. And people are finding out. And the more people find out about this whole situation, the less support there is for this Ukraine war effort. Volodymyr Zelensky has been traveling around Europe, we are told and shown in video clips, to beg for more money and more weapons. He asked for tanks. He was promised tanks. Those tanks aren't going to get there anytime soon, and they're not going to affect Russia's capacity to continue dominating and winning this war. And now Zelensky wants fighter jets. Today, the small nation of Moldova along Ukraine's border saw the resignation of their prime minister and the collapse of their government. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry released a statement on the Nord Stream. They said the Nord Stream gas pipeline is a major transnational infrastructure. The explosion incident had a serious negative impact on the world energy market and the global ecological environment. The U.S. must account to the world. And you can imagine that all of this will be voiced by these major countries at the next UN Security Council meeting. We are talking about countries who represent over half the world's population, and they agree with Cy Hersh's reporting that the United States and their allies are responsible for the Nord Stream 2 explosion. Considering that so many elements of the regime have said they intended to end the Nord Stream no matter what, and considering that we have been lied to consistently throughout this narrative, we can pretty well understand that this isn't just some product of foreign propaganda. And calling into question Cy Hersh's journalistic integrity and the quality of his sources seems a little disproportionate when you can simply notice that the accumulation of all of this evidence, as reported by Hersh and other sources, does map onto reality. This does paint a plausible, possible picture of what has happened. Whereas on the other side, we have gotten no information that substantiates any idea that Russia could have done this, and there's not even a suggestion that anyone else could have. So we don't need to have conversations about Cy Hersh's past in order to give serious weight to this reporting, because the reporting makes sense in light of everything else we know about the subject. But let's continue with the Ukraine situation. This is from yesterday in the Washington Post. Ukraine's rocket campaign reliant on U.S. precision targeting, officials say. Ukrainian officials say they require coordinates provided or confirmed by the United States and its allies for the vast majority of strikes using its advanced U.S.-provided rocket systems, a previously undisclosed practice that reveals a deeper and more operationally active role for the Pentagon in the war. The disclosure, confirmed by 3 senior Ukrainian officials and a senior U.S. official, comes after months of Kiev's forces pounding Russian targets, including headquarters, ammunition depots, and barracks on Ukrainian soil with the U.S.-provided high-mobility artillery rocket system, or HIMARS, and other similar precision-guided weapons, such as the M270 multiple-launch rocket system. One senior Ukrainian official said Ukrainian forces almost never launch the advanced weapons without specific coordinates provided by U.S. military personnel from a base elsewhere in Europe. Ukrainian officials say this process should give Washington confidence about providing Kiev with longer-range weapons. And the article goes on, give it a look if you like, but the point here is that throughout this war, we have, through NATO, provoked the conflict to begin with. We have exacerbated the conflict in countless ways, including by overt acts of war, like taking out the Nord Stream pipelines. We've supplied money, we've supplied weapons, weapon systems, and ammunition, and we have supplied intelligence, including for the assassination of high-ranking Russian military officers. And this has been reported at length for a while. And now we hear that we are helping the Ukrainians acquire and eliminate Russian targets. Where was the declaration of war by Congress? What part of any of this is allowed by our Constitution? And of course, none of that is relevant in the public conversation. All that matters is those brave Ukrainian citizens armed by the comedic actor and the sovereign territory of Ukraine. And it should be noted that when the Washington Post is talking about the Ukrainians striking targets in Ukraine, most of the time they're striking targets in what is now Russia. So the United States is essentially openly involved in an unprovoked war against Russia, ostensibly to protect another country who is not our ally. But we're told the war is not real because there aren't American military forces on the ground. And again, that part's not really true either. This war, to the extent that it is a war, is not a war of Putin's brutal aggression. It is not an invasion. It is a war that the regime has started in the name of the American people to protect regime interests in Ukraine. And the illegitimate administration, as a proxy for that regime, has shown no hesitation to compromise the interests of our allies or the people in those allied nations. Who are the Americans who actually support this? And of course, there are none, because anyone who knows any of this doesn't support the war. And the people who know this and still support the war aren't concerned with American interests. They're concerned with the interests of the regime. And that is why they advertise this as a good thing to normal people all the time. None of the advertising remotely honest. Thankfully, we're finally beginning to see some pushback to this. Matt Gaetz has offered up a bill to end all funding of this ridiculous effort. This is Fox News yesterday. Gaetz introduces resolution to end military and financial aid to Ukraine, urge peace deal. Matt Gaetz is introducing a resolution in the House on Thursday that calls on the Biden administration to end U.S. military and financial aid to Ukraine, while also urging all involved to secure a peace agreement after nearly a year of war in the region. The resolution, the Ukraine Fatigue Resolution, is being introduced by Gaetz and 10 co-sponsors and calls for the U.S. to, quote, end its military and financial aid to Ukraine and urges all combatants to reach a peace agreement. The resolution notes that since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the U.S. has been the top contributor to the Ukrainian war effort, with more than $110 billion in financial, military, and humanitarian aid to the U.S. ally. But Ukraine is not a U.S. ally. It includes more than $27.4 billion in security assistance. So let's hope that Congress is successful in cutting off the fire hose of funding between the illegitimate administration and Ukraine. And finally, this is from the Telegraph UK on Tuesday by Richard Kemp. Vladimir Putin is about to make shock gains. With Russia back on the offensive after significant Ukrainian combat successes around Kharkiv and Kherson in the second half of 2022, the past few weeks have been the bloodiest so far of an already bloody war, with both sides taking extraordinarily heavy casualties. Expect it to get worse. Well, as long as it's both sides, and it's not just you finally admitting that the Ukrainian side is being destroyed. Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov says Russia has mobilized much more than 300,000 troops, perhaps up to 500,000, and these are pouring into Ukraine in preparation for what is expected to be a major offensive in the coming days and weeks. Although Kiev has also been building up its forces and supplying them with modern equipment donated by the West, Putin has a much greater advantage in troop numbers than he did when he invaded a year ago. Despite repeated optimistic reports of Russia running low on artillery shells, a battle winner in this conflict, Putin's war stocks are vast, and his factories have been working around the clock to churn out even more. Oh, so Putin running out of ammo and troops was a lie? Putin made these rash and terrible decisions to start this invasion, and his army was being dominated everywhere it went? And this was all turning into a Russian war disaster, and they don't even have ammunition anymore? That was all a lie? Oh, yeah, of course it was all a lie. And we knew it was a lie at the time, and that's why I and many others said exactly that. Under pressure toward the end of last year, Russia withdrew its forces to positions of strength, trading ground for time as it massed resources for a planned hammer blow, while grinding down the Ukrainians in the east, softening them up for the assault to come. Much of this has been done by infantry attack, throwing away, quote unquote, expendable troops in time-honored Russian style. Yeah, you see that? The Russians don't care about their people. Putin is just leading them to their certain death so that he can restore the Soviet Union, even though that's not what he's doing at all. The Kremlin has, at the same time, been conserving artillery shells, though expending thousands each day around Bakhmut alone, and the armored vehicles that are so essential for the fast-moving blitzkrieg Putin is planning. Oh, blitzkrieg, I get it. Until now, the narrative in the West has been that Ukraine is comfortably winning this war, albeit while facing heavy bombardments on its major cities. The reality is much more complex. No, the reality is the exact opposite, because everything that came before was a lie. It's not complex. The non-reality we had been presented was just false. The latest estimates suggest that each side may have taken upwards of 120,000 casualties already, hardly indicative of a triumph for Ukraine. And there may be worse to come. The truth is that recent promises of new combat equipment for Ukraine, especially longer-range missiles, tanks, and other armored vehicles, are unlikely to be fulfilled in time to have an impact in this battle if Putin launches his offensive on the timetable Kiev predicts. So the tanks wouldn't go into service in this battle for 9 months or a year, but the battle could be over much sooner than that. So where are we sending those tanks? And why? With so many more men and resources at its disposal, Moscow will be able to sustain higher casualty rates. This is why Russia tends to do better in wars the longer they go on. It can bring more to bear over time. Even today, Putin does not fear high casualties. Disproportionate numbers of his troops are recruited from distant provinces rather than cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, where a stream of body bags could have some effect on what still remains rock-solid support for him in his war. No, they won't, because they know what's happening and they know what Russia is fighting for. It's always amazing how the elite Western media always presents this stuff. It's all the dumb backwoods hicks from distant parts of Russia that are willing to go to war. But it's not the smart people in St. Petersburg and Moscow, the sophisticated people. They're not interested in going to war. And if they see body bags in the streets, oh, Putin's in trouble. It's such nonsense. It's so dismissive of normal people in these countries. Another concern is that while Russian forces have performed abysmally, thwarted by low troop morale, inadequate numbers, badly maintained equipment, clumsy tactics, substandard battle discipline, poor logistics, the stiffest Ukrainian resistance, and an unexpectedly united effort from the West, some Ukrainian reports from the front indicate the Russians have been learning hard lessons and making much needed improvements, at least at the level of battle tactics and discipline. The Russian army was bleeding before, but it appointed new commanders and, as in the Second World War, may be recovering from its earlier disasters. Oh, yeah. I mean, look at that list of things this writer just described. How terrible everything was going for Russia in this Ukraine war, according to people who have lied about everything. But let's pretend they were telling the truth all the time. We can't just refute the central narrative we've been telling you for a year. So let's include all of that and its counter, because that will lead people to believe that conditions have changed. It's not that we've been lying the whole time about conditions. It's that they've just recently changed, due to circumstances beyond our control. We must therefore be prepared for significant Russian gains in the coming weeks. We need to be realistic about how bad things could be. Otherwise, the shock risks dislodging Western resolve. The opposite occurred last summer and autumn, as flagging support in parts of Europe and U.S. was galvanized by Ukrainian success. Which Ukrainian success? What Ukrainian success could they possibly be talking about? There has been no Ukrainian success throughout the entire time, except in the minds of these global elitists. It is essential that we not only maintain our combat supplies to Ukraine, but step it up even further and even faster. If Putin gains more ground, then Kiev will need to counterattack more strongly. and will need more armored vehicles, better air defenses, longer range missiles, and vast quantities of artillery shells and ammunition. The only alternative is that President Zelensky is forced to come to terms, handing victory to Russia and defeat to Ukraine and NATO. And does that sound that this viewpoint represents the viewpoint of people who care about the lives of the brave Ukrainian citizens? This writer is demanding a full-on World War III, which is what would happen if we continue to support this ridiculous effort, because the alternative is the regime suffering an unsustainable loss in Ukraine, a loss that has always been inevitable, except in that small instance where the entire world joins this fight in Ukraine and everything is destroyed. Hey, if everything is destroyed, no one can say we lost. And that's really the point, isn't it? I guess we'll have to see what the data says. I'll be back Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree, linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's